So, this topic is about the science of phobia and classical operant conditioning principle in their development. So, firstly, we introduce the science of phobia, basically refer to the psychological study of intense irrational fears and how they develop affects behavior and can be treated. So, it is important to study the phobia because they can seriously disturb the daily life, relationship, and mental health. So, understanding the science behind the phobia helps psychologists to design effective treatments and help society reduce the stigma around mental health problems. So, firstly, we define the phobia. A phobia is an excessive, irrational, and persistent fear of a specific object, situation, and activity. So, a normal fear is a natural response to real danger and disappear when the danger is gone. Phobia, on the other hand, continues even when there is no real threat and leads to avoidance behavior. So, what is difference between the fear and the phobia? Fear is basically the normal and the natural reaction to danger. Phobia is the irrational and extreme fear. Fear is usually temporary and goes away when the danger is gone. Phobia is persistent and long lasting. Fear does not usually affect the daily life, while phobia interferes with the daily activities. Fear proportionate to the actual threats, while phobia out of proportions to the actual threats. For example, in the fear, there is afraid of a barking dog, but phobia terrified of the dog even safe ones and avoid them. So there is some types of the phobias. For example, the first is the specific phobia, which is the fear of a specific object or situation, such as the spiders, height, and needles. Social phobia, which is the social anxiety disorders. For example, fear of social situation where a person feels judged or embarrassed. Agoraphobia. It is basically the fear of places where escape is difficult, such as the crowded market or the public transport. Some common psychological and physical symptoms of the phobia. The physical symptoms include the rapid heartbeat, sweating, trembling, dizziness, and shortness of breath. Some psychological symptoms include the intense anxiety, panic, fear or losing control, and strong avoidance of the feared object or the situation. So, the phobias develop according to the psychological theories. For example, in the psychological theories explain that phobias develop through learning and experiences, especially after the traumatic events. Learning theory suggests that phobias are not inherent but are learned through conditioning process like classical and operant conditions. There is some learning theories. For example, learning theories state that behaviors is acquired through experience. According to this theory, phobias are learned responses. Fear is learned through classical conditioning, and avoidance behavior is strengthened through operant condition. So, first is the classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a learning process in which a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a naturally fearful stimulus, leading to a learned fear response. It focuses on an involuntary automatic reaction. For example, Pavlov experiments and its role in explaining the learning. Leon Pavlov was a Russian psychologist who explained learning through his famous experiments on the dog. He observed the dog naturally salivate when the food is presented, which is an unlearned response called the unconditioned response. Pavlov then introduced a bell sound that initially produced no salvation. He repeatedly ring the bell just before giving food to the dogs. After several pairing, the dogs began to salivate when they heard the bell alone, even without the food. This showed that the bell had become a conditioned stimulus and salvations to the bell was a conditioned response. Parallel experiments demonstrate that learning occurs through forming associations between the stimuli, a process known as the classical conditioning. This theory plays an important role in explaining how the habits, emotional reactions, and phobias are learned through the experiences. Classical conditioning contribute to the development of phobia. Phobia is a learned fear, not a natural one. It developed through the classical conditioning. Unnatural objects or situations become associated with fear or trauma. The traumatic event acts as the unconditioned stimulus. Fear or anxiety is the unconditioned stimulus or response. The natural object become a conditioned stimulus. So fear in response to that objects become a conditioned response. Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is the type of learning in which behavior is shaped and maintained by its consequences. It was proposed by B.F. Skinners. In this form of learning, behavior followed by reward, which we call the reinforcement, are more likely to be repeated, while behavior followed by the punishment are less likely to occur again. For example, a student who studies regularly and gets good grades is likely to continue studying because the good grades act as a reinforcement. So, what is the operant conditioning versus classical conditioning? In classical conditioning, learning occur by association between the stimuli. In operant conditions, learning occur by association between the behaviors and consequences. In classical conditioning, it involved the involuntary automatic response. In operant conditions, it involved the voluntary behaviors. In classical conditioning, it focuses on what happened before the response, such as the stimulus. In operant condition, it focuses on what happened after the response, which is the reward and the punishment. So, for example, in the classical conditioning, fear after hearing a bell. Operant conditions example studying more to get good grades. So there is a scientist which is the B.F. Skinner's contribute to the operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner was one of the most important psychologists of behaviorism. He developed the theory of operant conditioning, which explained that behavior is shaped by its consequences. According to the Skinner, behavior that are followed by reinforcement become stronger and are repeated, while behavior followed by punishment are weakened but usually not temporary. Skinner's introduced the Skinner box, an experimental tool that allowed him to study learning in a controlled and scientific way. Through his experiment, he explained the positive reinforcement adding a reward and a negative reinforcement removing something unpleasant as the main force behind learning. He also described the schedule of the reinforcement, showing that behavior reward unpredictably and are more resistant to extensions. So avoidance behavior. Avoidance behaviors mean deliberately stay away from an object, situation, or activity that cause fear and anxiety. Instead of facing the fear stimulus, the person escape or avoid it to reduce the discomfort. Avoidance behavior is very common in phobia because avoiding the fear object immediately reduces the anxiety. This relief feels rewarding, so the person learns to avoid again in the future. This process is called the negative reinforcement. Although avoidance helps in the short term, it prevents the person from learning that the situation is actually safe. As a result, the fear remains strong and the phobia continue or even become worse over the time. So there is the role of the negative reinforcement in maintaining the phobia. Negative reinforcement play a key role in maintaining the phobia. For example, when a person with a phobia avoid or escape from a fear objects or situation, the anxiety immediately decrease. This reduction of fear is experienced as a relief, which act as a reward, because the unpleasant feeling, which called the anxiety, is removed. So the avoidance behavior become the negative reinforce. As a result, the person learned that avoiding the fear situation is an effective way to reduce the anxiety. So they repeat this behavior again and again. However, this prevents the exposures to the fear objects and stop the fears from decreasing naturally. Therefore, the negative reinforcement strengthen avoidance behavior and keep the phobia alive or over time. Phobia maintenance. Phobia maintenance means why a phobia continue and does not go away over time. Operant conditioning explain this through the negative reinforcement. For example, a person has a fear of dog. When they see a dog, they feel intense anxiety. So to reduce this fear, they cross the street or run away. As soon as they avoid the dog, the anxiety decreases. This relief from fear is rewarding because avoiding the dog removes the unpleasant feeling, which is the fear. The avoidance behavior is negatively reinforced. So this person learned that avoiding dogs reduce the anxiety. So they continue avoiding them in the future. Since the person never stay near the dogs long enough to learn that most dogs are harmless, the fear never decrease. Thus, the operant conditioning avoidance behavior is reinforced and the phobia is maintained over the time. So now the conditioning principle used in the treatments of the phobia. For example, conditioning principles are widely used in the treatments of phobia to unlearn the fear response and reduce avoidance behavior. Classical conditioning principles are used through the exposure based therapies. In exposure based therapies, the person is gradually and repeatedly exposed to the feared object or situation in safe environment. This leads to extensions where the control fear response weaken because the feared stimulus is no longer paired with the danger. Operant conditioning principles are always used by reducing the avoidance behavior and reinforcing brave or coping response. When a person faces the fear situation and experience reduced anxiety, this positive outcome reinforce approach behavior instead of the avoidance. Techniques like the systematic desensitizations combine both principles by pairing the relaxation a new person with the feared stimulus. In this way, continuing principles help to replace fear with calm response and allow phobias to decrease over time. So now there is the role of learning theories in the development and treatments of the phobia. The first is the classical conditioning, where the phobia form when a natural stimulus is paired with a frightening event causing a fear association. For example, being beaten by a dog, fear of all dogs. Offering conditioning, avoiding the fear objects reduce the anxiety temporarily, which reinforce the phobia through negative reinforcement. For example, avoiding the elevator to reduce the fear strength avoidance the behavior. Maintenance. Learn avoidance keep the fear alive near does not diminish naturally without the exposures. For example, classical approach, gradual exposure or systematic desensitizations help to break fear association. Operant approach, reinforcement approach, behavior, and coping strategies reduce the avoidance. So there is some importance like learning theory explain both how the phobias develop and persist and provide the structured effective methods for the treatments. Thank you so much.